Welcome back, Canada Catholic. All right, so it's been a minute since we've had a flip, but it's all good. Actually, some of you are like, nah, we had one on Napoleon like 4 days ago. All right, calm down. Now, in my first and eighth class, which is about like maybe a slide behind of some of you other classes, we left off on this. So I'm going to start the flip here, and if you've heard some of this stuff before, you can kind of just like fast forward a little bit until you get to some new content, all right? But we are going to be wrapping up the Industrial Revolution in this flip, okay? But in my last class, we just left off with the steam engine by James Watt, right? So, as we talked about in class, the original steam engine was actually designed to pump water out of coal mines, right? Because the demand for coal and iron had skyrocketed since the onset of the Industrial Revolution in the textile industry, leading to a growth in energy needs, leading to a growth in powering factory machines, leading to a growth in a lot of different things, right? So due to the growth of iron, particularly the iron industry being like established with pig iron and stuff like that, and the demand for iron, to actually make iron more malleable, you need coal, right? So there was a huge uptick in coal. And as we know, Great Britain was home to the Industrial Revolution because of all of their coal deposits, right? Now, as they dug these mines deeper and deeper and deeper, they needed to pump that water out, right? So the original steam engine was designed to pump out that water. It replaced animal needs and things like that. But crazy enough, James Watt didn't even invent the first one. The first ones were actually designed by two guys, Thomas Savery and another guy named John Newcomen, all right? Or that might be George Newcomen, but it's Newcomen, all right? N-E-W-C-O-M. C-O-M-E-N, Newcomen, all right? So those two guys designed the original too. But the problems with those original pumps is that they actually would like break pretty often, and they would like actually let steam off, kind of leading to you constantly needing to fill it back up again. James Watt's design, on the other hand, he came in as a repairman, and he added this piece right here. It's called a condenser, all right? So as the steam would build up, it would condense on the sides of the container and then dribble back down into the tank, so you didn't have to change the water as often, right? It made it much more streamlined, much more applicable. This steam engine, jot this down, would then be taken and repurposed and be used on tons of other items, including but not limited to locomotives, right, or trains, steamboats, steam-powered factories, power looms. It became the all-providing source for power needs in the 1800s. The steam engine, right? The steam engine changed everything. Changed transportation, changed production, changed it all, right? And it was originally designed just to pump water. Isn't that crazy? All right, so now, James Watt is such a huge figure that we now currently measure electrical current in his last name. James Watt is in a certain number of watts, right? So the steam engine is another huge, massive piece of information about this whole thing. You're going to have there we go. So, continuing forward though, everything's going to change, right? Everything's going to change. We've got a couple of things to add to this one too. You're going to also see a huge pattern of migration, right? With that migration, jot this down somewhere with like a little picture of a train near it. You're going to see the laying of railroads at a rapid pace, right? To make travel and the movement of goods much easier, right? And then as the rails began to be laid to move coal and iron, then they designed locomotives with steam power to actually move on them to replace animals yet again, right? But now that you've got these new railroads, now that you've got these new trains, and now that you've got all these new items, urbanization is going to take place as well. Now, urbanization, you only really need to write down the underlined stuff on this presentation. But urbanization is the movement of people to cities from country areas, right? So, with all these new inventions, the seed drill, the spinning jenny, the water frame, the like new power looms coming out as steam power progresses, the steam engine, they're slowly replacing people in production setups, right? You don't need as many people on a farm anymore. You don't need as many people in a factory anymore. So what this is going to lead to is a thing called urbanization, right? Where people are going to begin to move into the cities to find work because there's now growing a constant demand for factory workers as business begin to grow. A great example of urbanization movements is that of Manchester United Kingdom, right? Just like the Manchester United football team or Manchester City as well. 17,000 people in 1755, right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. By 1800, that number had grown to 70,000 people, right? In a matter of 50 years, they went from 17,000 to 70,000. That is urbanization, right? People begin to move into these different homes. They begin to bring their families with them. They begin to live in tight, cramped spaces so they can actually work in these factories, right? Urbanization. So you see these people flocking to cities left and right. Then another crazy thing that's going to happen is class structure is going to change completely. First of all, there's your steam power locomotive. There's your different classes that are popping up. Here's your other classes over here. Now, new social classes, okay? So now, what you could do for this slide, you could draw like a little triangle, right? So the new social class system that's going to get set up is like a new little triangle, almost like the old feudalism one. It's going to be broken down into 3 different categories. You're going to have your old money, which is at the top, right? Which is the former nobility. It's the old ruling class. It's the old nobles from everywhere. They're at the very, very top. But now you have a new one. The industrial middle class, right? The industrial middle class is the people coming into the game now. These are the people who are opening these factories. They're opening private businesses. They own railroads. They're entrepreneurs, all right? Now, an entrepreneur, of course, is a person who owns their own business, right, in a capitalist system. Now, the industrial middle class begins to grow. People begin to take shots, long shots, risks, and open businesses of their own, right? So now that you have an industrial middle class that's growing, that you all kind of, to this day, are slightly a part of, right? A lot of you are anyway. Then you had underneath them the people they employed in their factories. The industrial working class. That's your workers, right? Very, very, very poor. They work for nominal wages. A lot of them are children. A lot of them early on were women. Actually, crazy fact, whole families were recruited early on to actually work in these factories. They live in very foul-smelling apartments, most times with no running water and back-to-back housing, living very overcrowded. Sometimes families as large as 20 would be living in one room. Now, early on, wages were fine. People were making more money. They were living happier lives. But the industrial working class is now going to become the lowest class, all right? So, now, there's 2 areas of which your industrial working class would usually end up in. First of all, you've got your factories, right? So harsh conditions in the factories are just very, very rough, right? Conditions in the factories were not easy during these time periods because shifts could last as long as 12 to 16 hours. They employed men and women. They employed children as well. Machines had no safety mechanisms on them whatsoever. So let's say, hypothetically, your hand got caught inside of one of these machines. It would not turn itself off. It would keep running, and you would probably lose that hand, right? Factories had no ventilation. They had little to no sunlight. They were very hot, got extremely hot, and workers who got sick oftentimes got fired, all right, because there was no health insurance. There were no things like that. So conditions in the factories were very, very tough. And typically you had also a division of labor by your genders, right? Machine operators were typically women because they could use the machines easier, and they also, because using the machines is much easier, while the men were reserved for manual labor, particularly coal mining, all right? So machines were easier to operate. Unfortunately, though, the women only got paid about half of what a man got paid, okay? So a lot of your machine operators were women. Your manual laborers were men. But then you're unfortunately going to see as well some very harsh conditions in these factories, okay? So the Industrial Revolution also created that high demand for iron and coal, which had to be mined from the ground, right? Miners are going to be paid more, but conditions were much worse than they were in the factories. They work in practical darkness. There could be explosions or cave-ins at any time. Coal dust causes a thing called black lung disease, right? And oftentimes, most of your workers were men, but soon enough, women would be outlawed from working in the mines, right? Because the middle class, this new industrial middle class, actually had this huge campaign against oh, we shouldn't allow women to work down there. It's disgusting down there, and there's nasty men down there that are going to take advantage of them and things like that. And all this was started because a lot of times women would be working in the mines without their shirts on because it was so hot, right? So, and then the conditions in the coal mines were absolutely deplorable. Kids worked down there. They would open ventilation windows all the time. Men worked down there primarily at the seam, and women would actually be used for pushing carts and things like that. But it was extremely dangerous, and it caused black lung disease and could kill you very easily, right? But you did get paid quite a bit more. So then you're going to see also a dramatic tick in child labor, right? So funny enough, not funny enough, actually, this isn't funny at all. Write this down. The first people employed in factories were children. The very first people employed in all these factories were children because a lot of people resisted working in the factories early on. They didn't want to work in them because they reminded them of poorhouses, orphanages, and prisons, right? It was these really big brick buildings with no windows on them, and you knew if you went to work in them, it was going to be hot and you were going to struggle. People were like, I'd rather work at home and make cloth on my own and then sell it that way, right? But the problem was these factories are now making goods cheaper, so they're getting forced out, economically speaking, right? So children had the most dangerous jobs, and they were the first people employed in factories because the factory owners couldn't find people to work in them early on, so they were like, you know what? I know where we can find people to work. Let's go to the orphanages, right? So they would employ children from orphanages, right? Very Oliver Twist-like. You ever heard of this entire scenario, right? Children had some of the most dangerous jobs, right? Children could start working as early as 5. They would work in the mines hauling carts and opening air vents. And a big job that they had actually was repairing factory machines due to how small their hands were. So most of these machines, as we remember, were looms, right? They were used for weaving cloth. Well, since there's so many threads running at once, sometimes those threads are going to get tangled, okay? When those threads would get tangled, children had to go into the machines and untangle them using their really small hands. And sometimes those machines would kick back on, grabbing a kid's hand, breaking their fingers, and sometimes ripping the skin off of the tops of their hands, right? And just like in the mines, they could easily fall down a shaft and die, right? So child labor was at a massive uptick during this time period. Now, as we know later on, child labor would be outlawed, but it was a huge issue during the early onset of the Industrial Revolution, right? Now, there are some positives to the Industrial Revolution. Do not think it's all bad, okay? Some of the big positives are you've got more jobs now. People are actually making more money than they used to on the farms as well because wages are going up. Costs of things are going down, right? People can now afford things like underwear and new shirts and clothes, and they can actually go out and buy things for themselves. This massive, next to this cost went down, this thing called the Consumer Revolution actually popped up. When people were like, you know what, I'm going to go work X amount of hours, I'm going to get paid X amount of dollars, and I'm going to make a little extra money, and I'm going to spend it on myself. I'm going to go buy myself my own spoon, because for a long time, people would eat out of the same bowl as a family. So I got my own spoon though, right? So Consumer Revolution was huge. You also had the rise of these things called labor unions, which was a huge positive, which is an organization that was created to fight for the rights of workers, right? So these labor unions start popping up, and they start advocating for these workers. They're like, look, these workers have to have better conditions in the factories. They need to get paid more. They need health insurance, right? And if you don't give us what we want, they would have methods to achieve their goals, like striking, right? That was the biggest method that they would use, okay? Going on strike or refusing to work or boycotting certain goods, okay? Continuing forward. But the biggest negatives of the Industrial Revolution are, of course, people are dying, right? Terrible working conditions. Pollution is another huge one as well. Like, pollution ran rampant, right? It was bad. Coal ash going all over the place. Like dirty water being dumped into the rivers. And, it's a huge problem. And also, many children are going to lose fingers, hands, and their lives to machines or die in mining-related diseases. So, you've got a lot of negatives and a lot of positives with this entire thing. We are reaping the positives of it right now because we live in a society where we can go out and we can work and we can make money and we can go out and buy things and we can achieve what we want, right? At the early onset, though, things were very rough. Things did get better, as we know, but on the early onset, things were very, very hard, right? So, then you've got, okay, cool. All right, so don't write the socialism thing. Wait on that. Just write this first. Then you've got new ways of thinking, right? So as the Industrial Revolution begins to progress forward, you end up with this new concept called laissez-faire economics, right? Where the governments are not allowed to intervene in a business, right? So you've got the setup of our modern-day economic system, where governments don't actually look to take advantage of businesses or own them like they did during the period of exploration. Instead, entrepreneurs now own them, and the government reaps the benefits in the forms of taxes, right? So laissez-faire economics, no government intervention. Put a star next to that one, okay? So then you've just got, this is a great picture of all the massive outcomes of the Industrial Revolution. The pollution. Literature is going to be impacted by Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist. You've got slums as well, poor areas. You've got people making money on the other end as well. So it's like this really, really big double-edged sword. The Industrial Revolution was really, really hard. You've got crime that's coming out of this, disfigured children coming out of this. So it's a rough era. But then you've got crazy other stuff happening too, okay? You've got new forms of government, All right, so post-industrial revolution, you have two new forms of government popping up. They're called socialism and communism, right? Now, the Industrial Revolution set up these new classes, and new governments were born out of them. So now you've got the old money, the old nobility, and the upper class, right? You've got this industrial middle class, and now you've got this working class, right? Well, the working class is huge, right? And they are also now becoming ever more aware that where they are in society, because they're walking around, people in the industrial middle class. They see somebody on the streets now because they all live in these cities together, and they're like, that guy's got a lot more money than me, but I work twice as hard as he does. What the heck is that about? All right, so then you've got these new class conscious things showing up. So socialism was like the first thing to be born, right? Which is the ideas of social ownership of the means of production. It goes against the ideas of capitalism because it wants to take the entrepreneur out of the factory, right? They want to make it so like a entire village or a city or a group of people own the factory together and they make the money off of their labor, right? And it's a great idea. Doesn't really work in the pure sense, but it's a great idea, right? They want to use redistribution. So every time a company makes money, everyone in that company gets money evenly and equally, right? And then you've got self-management of the worker, the idea that there aren't any managers, there are no more bosses, there are no more foremen, right? The workers are working for their own reward, and if they don't work, they don't get paid. Screw those guys, right? So, but then you've got the other end of the spectrum, right? Well, not the other end of the spectrum, the far end. So socialism and communism, no matter what anyone tells you, are not the same thing, all right? So socialism is a big umbrella. Communism is taking socialism and trying to put it on like steroids, right? So communism is a political theory derived from this man, a German by the name of Karl Marx, right? Karl Marx, we will talk about him later on in the year when we get to Russia, right? During the late 1800s, advocates in his book, The Communist Manifesto, write that down, he advocates that there are two different groups of people out there. There are the new bourgeois, which is the industrial middle class, and the upper class, the people who have all the money. And then there is the proletariat. That's a new word we don't have yet. Write that down. P-R-O-L-E-T-E-R-A-I-T. I think that's how you spell it. The proletariat, which is the working class, right? So he believes that in an industrial society, which you need, right, that the proletariat is becoming ever more aware of how unfair working conditions are, right? That they are working hard and someone is literally, according to Marx, stealing their wages and stealing their labor, right? So it leads to a society in which a violent class war leads to a society in which property is completely owned by a public and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs, right? It is a phenomenal idea on paper, but it has never, despite what anybody tells you, has never been successful. No one has ever achieved a true communist state, not once, all right? So that's Karl Marx and communism. We'll get into those ideas a lot more in depth as we get to Russia and things like that during their 1917 revolution, but that is where we're going to wrap it up. I will see you guys later. Have a good one. Bye.